Hey guys, welcome back to another episode on Heinous Beliefs, the podcast where we crack open the darkest crimes rooted in belief systems. I'm your host, Ria, and let me just say whether you're driving, cooking, chilling at work, or hiding from your responsibilities, I want you to know that I appreciate you. Wherever you are tuning in right now, thank you so much, you guys. So, I've been thinking about something that I'm going to be adding to the podcast, not this one. The next episode is going to have it. So, pretty much when you subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Patreon, these episodes from here on out will have this segment where I tell you guys a little bit about myself. I tell you like a random fact about me, or maybe something that I want to share with you guys from my day before or the day that I'm having, right? The day that I'm recording. I could probably tell you guys something that happened that day or just how my day is going in general, how I'm feeling, and all that good stuff. Because I feel like I am a bit detached from my audience. So I want to relate with you guys a little bit better. Now, that being said, today's episode is pretty heavy. We're diving into a heartbreaking case where two children died. So it's not an episode that I would recommend listening to around children. It's not gruesome. It's not a gruesome episode, but it does have to do with medical neglect and prolonged suffering. So you guys already know listener discretion is advised. Take your time, make sure that you are ready to listen to an episode like this. If it's too triggering, take your time, take a break, okay? If you're sensitive to stories involving child death or medical neglect, this is your cue to skip ahead and wait for the next episode. I'm not going to guarantee that the next episode is going to be any better, but yeah. Those are the kind of cases that we cover here. So just remember, listener discretion is advised, okay? But if you are going to be here for this episode, you already know, go ahead and grab your tea, grab your coffee, get cozy. Let's get into it. So today we're going to be talking about Herbert and Catherine Schaible. If you pass them on the street in Philly, you probably wouldn't look twice, okay? This was a white couple, middle class, pushing a big old stroller with 7 kids in it, probably heading to church or the grocery store. This was a real unassuming picture here. They lived in a small row home in the Ronhurst neighborhood of Northeast Philly. Nothing fancy, just a modest setup where they homeschooled their 7 kids and kept to themselves. Very isolated, okay? But behind these quiet exteriors was a whole belief system that was not only dangerous, it was extreme and it caused isolation from the rest of society. And we know how harmful it can be. So Herbert was the definition of a laid back, soft spoken type of guy, okay? He was the kind of man that you never really expect any trouble from. He followed the rules. He never caused any issues. He was just laid back. He put his head down. He was nice, okay? He worked at the church at the private school area. The private school was called First Century Gospel Church School. Okay, this was a school that was kind of an extension of the church. Y'all know how they do those school churches. So he was basically teaching there. He was brought up in this organization. So everything that he was teaching them was everything that he was taught. Okay, so he really was very much into the idea that this was his purpose. He believed that his role was to raise up the next generation of believers who'd stay away from the worldly influence, especially with doctors and medicine. Okay, he wasn't out here trying to challenge anything that the church had to say. He wanted to follow it to a T. He was the church. Like he lived every single word to the core. Now, Catherine, his wife, she wasn't even any less devout, okay? If anything, she was more devout than him. She was super hands-on. She was a hands-on mom. She homeschooled the kids, all 7 of them, okay? She cooked everything from scratch and she never really let them watch TV, no media consumption. They barely listened to music that wasn't like gospel music. And she pretty much embodied that church. She was the church. Just like Herbert was the teachings of the church, she wanted to show that she was, a supporting wife, and she also believed in her husband as well. Every decision she made, from the clothes that her kids wore to how they spent their time, was guided by faith, and not just faith in God, but faith in the church. The church was very specific about their interpretations of God's will and God's word. So that's what they followed. She didn't just believe in the doctrine, right? She wasn't just a believer of doctrine. She built her whole world around it. She was deep in it. Her whole lifestyle, her children's lifestyle, her husband's lifestyle was all in it. Not just a belief system, but a way of life. Now let's break down the church. They were a part of the first century gospel church. It's a tiny church, isolated congregation, under 500 members, if anything, and extremely fundamental. Like if you think of an average conservative church and then crank that up about 100%, yeah, that's what we're looking at here. They follow the King James Bible to the letter and believe anything outside of that, science, medicine, or even Christians who thought differently than they did, to them, the modern world is a spiritual trap. Their biggest beliefs was no doctors, no pediatricians, no clinics, no vaccines, not even cough syrup. Why? Because they were taught that true believers should only rely on God for healing. They believed that sickness was a test or a punishment sent from God, and going to the doctor meant that you were trying to dodge the punishment or that test, right? Putting your faith in a man instead of God at this point. That was seen as spiritual weakness, and weakness in their eyes was dangerous. This wasn't just something that they preached on Sundays, this was a daily lifestyle. They didn't even keep medicine in the house. And if the kids got sick, it was prayer, fasting, anointing oil, rinse, repeat. They thought that even thinking about a doctor, even thinking about a physician helping out their children or helping them out was a sin. He told his congregation, this is Pastor Nelson Clark here. Pastor Nelson Clark, their leader, was loud about this. He told his congregation that if you were truly faithful, you don't need modern medicine. In fact, if you rely on doctors, it shows that you don't trust God. That message got drilled into people's heads from the time they were kids. So Herbert and Catherine, who grew up in this environment, it wasn't just a belief for them, right? It was their whole reality. It was like a spiritual bubble that blocked out all common sense whatsoever. Everything was filtered through this church said, the church did, the church said this, the church didn't say that. It was all revolving around this church. Let's talk a little bit about Pastor Nelson A. Clark. This dude wasn't just like, your friendly, pass around the pamphlet type of preacher. He wasn't, one of those preachers that you see on the roadside. No, he was old school with it, okay? Fire and brimstone, shouting from the pulpit like he was mad at the whole world. And not in a loving, turn your life around type of way, okay? He was full of God is gonna smite you type energy. He was preaching that even things like modern medicine, TV, or public schooling were weapons of the devil. Clark ran the first century gospel church like a spiritual boot camp. He was known for his rigid sermons where he would go off about how America was falling apart because people just were not living right. And if you were sick, it wasn't just the germs or bad luck here. This was your sin, okay? This was sin trying to humble you. He told his congregation that every sniffle or every fever was a direct result of being out of step with God. So if your baby got sick, it wasn't a medical emergency, it was a moral failure. He pushed this message for decades and people soaked it in. This man legit believed and thought that going to the doctor was an insult to God. He says things like, if you call an ambulance, you might as well say Jesus can't heal you. People in the congregation grew up hearing things like this over and over again. From Sunday school to adulthood, it was drilled into them. So, this kind of repetition is bound to stick, okay, especially for children. It was made up to control them, and that is exactly what it did, mind control. And Pastor Clark, he didn't back down, not even when children died. When children were losing their lives because of this barbaric idea, he didn't care. He kept preaching this sermon. Now, for Pastor Clark, this man had power. And when I talk about power, I'm not talking about in, mainstream society at this point. I'm talking about the power he had in this isolated community. This was a community where everyone got the same worldview. The pastor wasn't just a pastor, he was the voice of God. When he speaks, it's law. People didn't question him, they didn't ask him where he was getting his information from, they didn't care about stuff like that, okay? Because he was the mouthpiece of God. And think about it, he wasn't just telling people to skip the doctors, he discouraged health insurance. He told people hospitals were full of doubt and danger, and that if you relied on science, you were opening your soul to darkness. And people bought into this so hard that they refused basic care even when their children were dying. So, yeah, the Schaibles weren't some wild eyed cult parents acting on a whim here. They were obedient followers of a doctrine that demonized modern medicine and glorified suffering as proof of faith, right? And there's no God coming out of nowhere to tell them that they're wrong here, right? No one has been confirmed yet. So this is just their belief. They were doing exactly what they were taught. And when a whole community believes that turning to a doctor is a betrayal of God, that is something that can be absolutely classified as harmful. That is deadly, it's dangerous, it's wrong. This whole concept of divine healing, it didn't just pop up with Pastor Clark at the first century gospel church. This stuff has been around for centuries. Like back in the early 1900s, during the Pentecostal holiness revival days, we're talking about tents in the middle of the field, folks shouting in tongues, catching the Holy Spirit, dropping in the ground. Like, they just got electrocuted or something. But with this Jesus, no one really is going to ask any questions about that, right? It was deep. Back then, modern medicine wasn't exactly reliable, right? The hospitals were expensive, segregated, especially for Black people. White people, usually probably would have affected the poor white people, but prayers wasn't just like a spiritual thing, it was survival at this point. See, back then, you couldn't always trust the system, especially if you were Black. So people leaned heavy into faith. It made sense at the time. Medicine was a hit or miss. A lot of people were dying in the hospitals from infections, poor care, all that stuff. So you can see why a group of people like this will turn to a God, even though they see that the results are not even coming. Right. And some people actually would get better, right? Whether it was faith or rest or just good luck, it reinforced the belief that healing came from above, not a prescription pad. Science has leveled up, right? We have antibiotics, we have vaccines, we have scans, we have surgery, we have answers. Faith healing did not evolve with the rest of the world. There's no results from it. Some churches, like the first century gospel, stayed frozen in time. They took old school beliefs and built a wall around them. Now, no doctors, no nurses, no hospitals, no expectations, right? You have a fever, pray about it. Broken bone, pray about it. If God answers your prayers, cool, His will. If He doesn't, oh well, He's trying to test you, okay? He's trying to test you to see if you're going to stay with Him, even with broken bones. And that's another reason why I would never serve any of these deities, because it just seems like y'all have to just keep sacrificing stuff. It's too much for me. Now, let's talk a bit about the cases that have us sitting here today. So here's where the trigger warning is going to start. I told you guys earlier, it's not a gruesome case, but it does highlight prolonged suffering and it highlights medical neglect. So if that is triggering for you, here's where you jump off, okay? Now let's rewind to 2009. Their son Kent was just 2 years old, barely even talking full sentences yet, okay? He started coming down with what looked like a cold, nothing crazy at first, runny nose, slight fever, cough. Any other parent must have thought, let's just keep an eye on it, right? That's usually what you do with children, especially toddlers, because if your fever is not at a certain point, they more than likely are going to send you back home. Some parents will probably give some Tylenol at 2. I don't recommend Tylenol because I think they're still too young for that. But, parents try to do as much as they possibly can before they head to the hospital. But the Schaibles here, this was not their plan, okay? As Kent got sicker, things started to spiral. He stopped eating. He got weaker over time. He couldn't hold himself up. Imagine a 2-year-old that can't hold themselves up because of how weak and tired they are, because they're not eating, they're malnourished, they're in pain. Okay. He was breathing heavy. He was wheezing. He was struggling. And instead of dialing 911 or taking him to maybe the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which is one of the really good ones, this is literally one of the best pediatric hospitals in the country. They called on Jesus instead, okay? Instead of doing that, they called on Jesus. That's it. No meds, no doctors, just prayer circles, oil, anointing, and they asked God to intervene in this, okay? That was the prayer. The prayer was for God to do something. They don't need the doctors. They prayed over Kent. They gathered the kids to lay hands on him. They stayed up all night pleading for a miracle, but the signs were there. This baby boy was crashing. His body was shutting down. His lips were turning blue. He was in distress. Okay, imagine what kind of pain that child was in. And still, no hospital, no ambulance, not even a call to the nurse's hotline. Okay, not even like a little bit of, hey, what can I do to relieve my child from this? No. Mm-mm. They believed that God was going to heal him because that's what they were raised to believe, right? That was the rule. Doctors were out, prayers were in. Eventually, Kent does pass away over time. He was in pain, he struggled, so he does die. He died in that house, surrounded by people, human beings that were praying for him. Not just one person, okay? Multiple people were in that house, in and out of that house, coming back and forth and praying for him, laying hands. The cause of death was bacterial pneumonia. Now, if you don't know, pneumonia in a child is no joke, but it is treatable. Especially in 2009, a round of antibiotics, fluids at the hospital would have saved that child's life. The medical examiner said to the officers that Kent Schaible didn't have to die. Okay, this wasn't a rare disease. This wasn't a freak accident. This was preventable. When the truth came out, it hit Philly like a punch in the gut. Folks couldn't believe what was happening. The state charged Catherine and Herbert with involuntary manslaughter and child endangerment. The courtroom was pretty packed and people wanted justice. But this couple only got 10 years probation. Okay. But the judge laid down a major rule that they were not allowed for something like this to happen again. If they had another child that had medical needs, they were required legally to go give that child medical help. Okay, now fast forward 4 years. After losing Kent, Herbert and Catherine had another baby boy named Brandon, just 8 months old. Okay, not even crawling yet. Just a chubby cheek baby that's just babbling about. But in April 2013, Brandon started showing signs that something was wrong. He was breathing really hard. He had a high fever. He wasn't eating. He was barely moving. And he was completely lethargic. Just remembering those symptoms, you would think these parents are going to spring into action. Remember, these parents were already on probation, right? The court had told them that they had to seek medical care. They were now under legal obligation to seek medical care. First of all, I want to talk about the fact that they were only given 10 years probation. And I think we know why, okay? I think we know that the religious affiliation here, the religion absolutely plays a freaking role here, okay? They were out and about and were only given 10 years probation. Now, if one of your kids were to be sick, how do you sit there and watch them suffer to death? Huh? And then you tell me that you somehow have more children and do the exact same thing to them. Anyway, the Schaibles go ahead and do the exact same thing that they did last time. They prayed, just like they did for Kent, okay? They prayed, not even a second thought. They never thought about the ER, no urgent care, not even a damn thermometer. They did not feel like it. They didn't want it. They said this child has to go through this pain so that our God can be happy. But Brandon got worse. He got dehydrated. He started to struggle to breathe. He was already struggling before, but this was worse. And they still didn't do anything. They still prayed. Now, don't forget, this is an 8-month-old baby, okay? This is an 8-month-old baby that they're watching wither away, watching in pain. Eventually, Brandon does pass away. 8 months old, another baby gone way too soon. Now, this is again bacterial pneumonia and dehydration. So, Kent was bacterial pneumonia. Now, Brandon here was dehydrated and had bacterial pneumonia. The medical examiner said it again. This was a completely preventable death. A hospital visit would have saved him IV fluids, antibiotics, and a breathing machine if needed. Would have solved all of this. When investigators showed up, the Schaibles told them straight up they didn't call a doctor because they were trusting in the Lord to heal their son. Same story, same blind faith, same tragic ending. But this time, the system, I guess, was trying to punish them. The state charged them with third-degree murder, involuntary manslaughter, and child endangerment. And I don't know why they're packing up all of these crimes as if they were about to give them some long sentence, but they were sentenced to about 3.5 to 7 years in prison. Now, eventually the sentencing does come down and they were only sentenced to 3.5 to 7 years in prison. Again, I don't know why they piled on all those charges because they weren't really going to do anything. But even behind bars, the couple still is not expressing any kind of remorse. They were still wrapped up in their beliefs in obeying God and still convinced that they did the right thing. They're actually out right now. And the story did make national headlines. You know, it was a very big story in Philadelphia at that time. But Brandon Schaible didn't have to die. Kent did not have to die. None of it had to happen. This was all again centered on a belief system, right? This is still all centered on imagination. You are neglecting your children and believing in what another human being is telling you a God said. I don't know if my brain is capable of that kind of belief, but I can't even fathom it. Now when the news broke that, these people let another child die, the public snapped like it was an outrage. It was pure disbelief mixed with heartbreak and fury. People were saying, yo, like we gave them a second chance. The court gave them a second chance. The court gave them the least amount of punishment, right? So why would they do this again? It was like watching the same horror movie twice and then not even being able to stop what was going to happen. Now, social media blew up. Hashtags, threads, Facebook rants. People were letting it out. People were not letting this slide. They just wanted to have this conversation, which is amazing. And the conversation were not just about the Schaibles. It was not just centered about the Schaibles here. It shifted to something way bigger. How much protection should religion really get when it comes to parenting? Where's the line between freedom and belief systems? Straight up child neglect is what we're talking about here. See, Pennsylvania had these religious exemption laws baked into the child welfare system. That meant that if you were a part of a religion that didn't believe in medicine, the law gave you a pass if you didn't take your child to the doctor, which is wild, right? Like you could literally be exempt from the responsibility of basic medical care if you said, well, the church said I don't have to do it. All you had to say was that you had a religious belief that didn't, you know, expect you to give your child medical care and you were fine. No one would ask you any questions. Brandon's death cracked this whole system open. People started asking, who's really being protected by these laws here? The parents or the kids? Lawmakers got put on blast. Child advocacy groups came out, pediatricians, and even some former faith healing believers stepped up and said, enough is enough. Even people with religious backgrounds were like, yo, I believe in God too, but he gave us brains, doctors, hospitals for a reason. People weren't attacking religion, they were calling out the way that it was being used to dodge responsibilities, which is obviously amazing. Great. Thank you very much. But we should also talk about the fact that we have adults walking around with imaginary friends. That's why shit like this happens. But, that's another conversation for another day. They had rallies, they had interviews, they had petitions to change this law. People started digging into the similar cases across the country. Turns out Pennsylvania wasn't the only state letting this slide. It started to become a nationwide wake-up call. Brandon's death didn't just expose a crack in the system, it blew a hole in it. And just for a minute, it felt like everyone from politicians to PTA moms were on the same page. Fate should never be a reason for a child to die. Okay. So yeah, the Schaibles were the face of this whole movement. Their names were on the headlines, but the deeper, uglier truth here is it was the system, the actual laws that let things like this happen. See, Pennsylvania, like over 30 other states at the time, had religious exemption laws tucked into their child welfare codes, right? These laws basically gave parents a pass that they could claim that their actions or inactions were based on religious beliefs. Now, think about how wild that is. The law was supposed to protect the children, right? But instead, it created a loophole where beliefs could be used as a shield for medical neglect. And the Schaibles did not come up with this on their own, okay? They were raised in a system that told them that this was okay. Their praying instead of a doctor was the solution. Now, again, these beliefs can be harmful in so many different ways. And I think, again, this is why we have these conversations. This is why we're talking about the things that we talk about on this podcast, because I need people to realize that we can't just let people believe whatever they believe. I know it sounds good to say. I know, we want to be cordial and we want to let people express themselves as much as possible, but there are lines to be drawn, okay? There are lines to be drawn. There should be limits, and we should be able to call those limits when the time comes for it, because children are suffering, people are dying, and it's all rooted in what people are believing. This is all rooted in belief systems, and the quicker we address that, the better for society. All right, you guys, that is it for me. Thank you guys so much for every single person that has clicked on that play button. I really do appreciate y'all. I know y'all hear me say it all the time, but I ain't gonna stop saying it. Okay, I'm gonna keep saying it every day, all day. I really do appreciate you guys. I'm almost at 3,000 listens, so please keep sharing the podcast. Follow the podcast platform you're listening on so you can get notifications. And also, don't forget that we're gonna have Apple Podcast subscriptions coming up, and also Patreon. When those become available and you are subscribed to either one of those two platforms, you get an extra episode on Wednesdays, and you get access to the Discord so we can chop it up, have conversations, talk about these cases, okay? Because they can be pretty heavy. So I thought, it would be a good idea to create a space where people can go and talk about it. If the Discord doesn't work too well, I am going to switch to a Facebook group. So, we'll see how that works. But apart from that, I want to say thank you guys so much. I really do appreciate it. I hope you guys have a good rest of your day. Here is, a few things that you guys can think about. What exactly is it that I need belief for, right? Like when you think about the belief systems and stuff like that, what do you think you need a belief for? And then secondly, is a human being enough to convince you that a God somewhere wants you to do a certain thing? Is that something that you would be convinced by? Those are the two questions that I want you guys to leave with today. And just think about that. Think about, would you drink the Kool-Aid? Would you really? Like what is something that someone could say to you for you to actually be like, okay, yeah, I believe you. Stuff like that. But yeah, I will go ahead and hop off here. I appreciate y'all so much. Have a good rest of your day. Bye.